My husband grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave a mark, 3 days before our 5th anniversary, because I told his sister no. Chloe had called that evening asking, again, to use our joint card for an emergency, the 4th time that month. I said, calmly, that we needed to talk about setting a limit, that our own savings couldn't keep absorbing her emergencies indefinitely. My husband, Adam, didn't even let me finish the sentence. He crossed the kitchen, grabbed my arm, and yelled that I was being cruel to someone who'd been through more than I could ever understand. His fingers pressing hard enough into my skin that I gasped out loud. He let go almost immediately, stepped back like he'd shocked himself, and went quiet. I stood there in our kitchen, rubbing the red marks forming on my wrist, looking at a man I had never once seen raise a hand toward me in 6 years together, wondering what exactly his sister had done to earn a loyalty capable of turning him into someone I didn't recognize. I didn't know, standing there that night, just how carefully Chloe had been building that loyalty for years, or what it would eventually cost his entire family to find out the truth. My name is Emily. I'm 33, and I work as a claims adjuster for a regional insurance company, a job that, looking back, gave me instincts I didn't realize I'd eventually need to use on my own family. I met Adam 8 years ago through a coworker's housewarming party, and for most of our relationship, I would have described him as steady, generous, and fiercely protective of the people he loved. Qualities I admired right up until the moment they turned into something that hurt me directly. Adam's sister, Chloe, is 4 years younger than him, and their family history carries a weight I understood only in outline for most of our marriage. When Chloe was 9 and Adam was 13, she fell from a tree in their backyard while the two of them were playing, breaking her leg badly enough to require 2 surgeries and months of physical therapy. Adam had been the one supervising her that afternoon, technically, and their parents, in the exhausted, frightened aftermath of that accident, let a kind of unspoken blame settle onto him that he carried for the rest of his life, whether or not it was ever fair. Chloe grew up, in the family's telling, as the daughter who'd suffered because of a moment's carelessness, and Adam grew up as the brother who owed her, in some deep, unspoken way, for the rest of both their lives. I knew this history early in our relationship, and I respected it deeply, in the way you respect something painful in a partner's past, without fully understanding its weight until much later. I never begrudged Adam his protectiveness toward his sister, even when it occasionally meant compromises in our own plans. A vacation shortened so he could help her move. A Christmas budget quietly redirected toward a gift for her instead of something for us. I told myself, for years, that this was simply the cost of loving someone with a complicated family history, and that my role was to be understanding, not to keep score. I'm not writing this pretending I handled every part of it well. I let resentments build silently for longer than was healthy, telling myself I was being generous when I was really just avoiding a conversation I didn't know about start. That avoidance, in hindsight, gave Chloe years of room to operate without anyone in the family asking the harder questions. The requests for money had always existed in our marriage, in small occasional bursts I'd never thought much about. Help with a car repair here, a security deposit there. What changed, starting about 2 years ago, was the frequency and the size. It started with Chloe asking to be added as an authorized user on our joint credit card, just for emergencies. A request Adam agreed to almost immediately, without discussing it with me first. I found out only when I noticed a charge from a boutique clothing store I didn't recognize, and Adam explained, a little defensively, that Chloe had needed something for a job interview, and he hadn't wanted to make her feel like she had to ask permission for every small thing. Then it was the pattern of those charges, which grew steadily larger and less clearly tied to actual emergencies. A weekend trip charged as networking for her new business. A laptop charged as essential for job searching. Expenses that, individually, always came with some reasonable-sounding explanation, and that collectively, over 18 months, added up to more than $12,000. Then it was the way any pushback from me got reframed, almost instantly, as evidence that I didn't understand what Chloe had been through. If I mentioned, gently, that the needy to talk about a budget, Adam would remind me of the accident, of everything Chloe had endured as a kid, in a tone that made further discussion feel almost cruel to attempt. I started dreading conversations about money entirely, not because I didn't want to help his sister, but because every conversation about limits somehow became a referendum on my compassion instead of a reasonable boundary between two adults managing a household. Then it was Adam's parents, who I noticed increasingly deferred to Chloe in family decisions in ways that went beyond ordinary parental favoritism. Vacations planned entirely around her schedule, holiday gatherings rearranged at the last minute because something had come up for her, financial help from them that, based on offhand comments I overheard, seemed to be happening on a scale I hadn't fully appreciated until I started paying closer attention. Then it was the way our own friends started noticing things I'd been too close to see clearly myself. My close friend Nadia mentioned, at a dinner we'd hosted, how tense the room had gotten when someone brought up Chloe's name in passing, and asked me afterward, carefully, whether everything was okay. I brushed it off at the time, embarrassed that the tension had been visible enough for a friend to comment on it, though her questions stayed with me longer than I let on. None of these, on their own, felt like something worth the kind of confrontation that risked Adam's relationship with his family, a relationship already shaped by guilt neither of us had ever fully unpacked. That was, I think, exactly the space this had always operated in. Nothing rising to the level of an open fight, until the night Adam's hand closed around my wrist made it impossible to pretend the pattern was still manageable. That night in the kitchen wasn't the beginning of anything. It was just the first time the pressure building for 2 years finally found somewhere physical to go. I didn't confront Adam again that night. I went to bed in the guest room, iced my wrist quietly so I wouldn't have to explain the marks to anyone, and spent most of the night unable to sleep, replaying the accident story Adam had told me so many times over the years, trying to understand how a moment from his childhood still had this much power over our marriage as adults. 3 days later, still shaken, still turning it over, I did something I hadn't done in the entire 8 years I'd known this family. I logged into the joint credit card's full transaction history and started actually reading through it, line by line, instead of skimming past the pattern I'd already half noticed. What I found reframed everything. Buried among the emergency charges were payments to a property management company in a suburb 2 states away, recurring monthly, going back nearly 3 years. I searched the address listed on the payments and found a small rental property, owned, according to public county records, under an LLC with a name I didn't recognize, until I traced the LLC's registered agent back to Chloe herself. I sat at our kitchen table with my laptop open long after Adam had gone to bed,
scrolling through statement after statement, feeling something in my chest shift from confusion into a colder, clearer kind of focus. The property tax records were public, easy enough to find once I knew what I was looking for. The monthly rent income listed on the separate document I found through the county assessor's site put the property comfortably in the black, generating a modest but steady profit every month. The entire time Chloe had been describing herself at every family dinner as barely scraping by. My sister-in-law wasn't scraping by on emergency expenses. She owned a rental property generating steady income, quietly built over years, using money that, based on the timeline, included funds she'd been simultaneously requesting from us and from her parents under the framing of financial desperation. I didn't tell Adam what I'd found, not yet. Something in me went very still instead of furious, the particular stillness that comes from realizing that confronting this carelessly could let Chloe reframe the entire situation before anyone outside the family had a chance to see the actual facts clearly. I used skills from my own job without really meaning to, pulling public records the way I would for a claims investigation, cross-referencing property tax filings, business registration dates, and the timeline of emergency withdrawals against the LLC's formation date, which lined up almost exactly with the first time Chloe had asked to be added to our card. I also quietly reached out to a former coworker of Chloe's, a woman named Priya I'd met once at a family barbecue years earlier, using a vague excuse about wanting to reconnect. Over coffee, Priya mentioned, almost offhandedly, that Chloe had left her old job over 2 years ago, not because of the layoff she'd always described to the family, but because of an internal investigation into expense report discrepancies that the company had quietly settled by asking her to resign rather than pursuing it further.
During those same weeks, I found myself relying on instincts from work more than I expected to. The particular patience it takes to build a case slowly, instead of reacting to the first suspicious detail. The discipline of not confronting a claimant until every piece of documentation is solid enough to withstand pushback. It felt strange, applying that discipline to my own marriage, but it also felt like the only way through that didn't risk blowing up everything before I actually understood what I was dealing with. I also started noticing, with a kind of quiet grief, how much smaller my own voice had become in decisions about our shared money over the past 2 years. Decisions I'd once had equal say in and had slowly stopped fighting for, one deferred conversation at a time. I kept building the file over the following weeks, careful to keep my own behavior toward Adam and his family exactly the same on the surface. Polite at gatherings, warm with Chloe when I saw her, giving no indication that I was quietly assembling a picture of exactly how long and how deliberately this had been running. Each night, I added dates and documents to a folder on my own laptop, the same methodical habit I used at work when a claim didn't add up and needed careful, patient unraveling instead of a rushed accusation. Priya mentioned something else during that coffee, almost as an aside, that changed the shape of everything for me. She said Chloe had told a very similar story about a difficult financial situation years earlier, back in college, when she'd convinced a roommate to co-sign a private loan to help her through a rough semester. A loan the roommate ended up paying off almost entirely alone after Chloe stopped contributing and eventually stopped speaking to her altogether. I tracked the roommate down through an old alumni directory, a woman named Dana, who now lived in Colorado. She confirmed the story in detail, still visibly frustrated by it a decade later, describing almost the exact same emotional playbook I now recognized from my own marriage. The framing of herself as someone who'd suffered uniquely,
The quiet assumption that anyone close to her owed her financial support as a form of ongoing compensation for that suffering. Dana told me she'd spent years quietly assuming she was the only person who'd ever fallen for that particular version of Chloe, and that hearing my own story confirmed something she'd suspected but never had a way to verify. That the pattern hadn't been a one-time lapse in judgment on Chloe's part, but a strategy she'd simply carried forward, refined, and applied again whenever a new source of guilt or sympathy presented itself. Then, Dana told me something that reframed even the accident story I'd believed for 8 years. She said Chloe had told her once, during a late-night conversation in college, that she didn't actually remember falling from that tree the way the family's version described it. That in her memory, she'd climbed down on her own before slipping on the ground below, not fallen the dramatic distance the story had always implied. Dana hadn't thought much of the comment at the time. I couldn't stop thinking about it once she said it to me. Chloe hadn't just been quietly exploiting family guilt built around a childhood accident. There was a real possibility the severity of that accident and the blame it had assigned to Adam for over 20 years had never fully matched what actually happened. And she had built an entire adult life, financially and emotionally, on a version of events convenient enough that no one in the family had ever thought to question it. I didn't confront Chloe directly. I brought everything to Adam first, alone, on a night I chose carefully, sitting across from him at our kitchen table, the same table where he'd grabbed my wrist weeks earlier. I laid it out slowly. The rental property under Chloe's LLC. The timeline matching her emergency requests almost exactly. Priya's account of the expense report investigation. Dana's story about the college loan. And finally, gently, because I knew this part would hurt him more than anything else, Dana's memory of what Chloe had said about the tree. Adam sat with all of it in a silence heavier than any I'd seen from him before. He didn't defend Chloe the way he had every other time I'd raised a concern about her. He just kept staring at the printed property records, at his sister's name on documents that told a story completely different from the one he'd spent 20 years believing he owed a debt to. He called Chloe himself 2 days later and asked me to be there when he did, which felt like its own kind of turning point after years of these conversations happening entirely without me, decided in phone calls I was never part of and only heard about after the fact. He asked her, calmly at first, about the rental property. She tried denial, then a vague explanation about an investment a
Friend helped her set up. Each version thinner than the last as Adam laid out details she clearly hadn't expected him to have. When he finally asked her, quietly, what she actually remembered about the day she fell from the tree, there was a long silence on the line before she said, in a much smaller voice than either of us had ever heard from her, that she didn't want to talk about that. Adam apologized to me that same night, and many nights after, for the wrist, for years of letting his guilt override his judgment, for a debt he'd been paying his entire adult life toward a story that may never have been entirely true. We went to couples counseling together, working through not just what Chloe had done, but the harder question of how his family's guilt had shaped both of us without either of us fully realizing it, until it left a mark I could actually see. Nadia was one of the first people I told the fuller story to, once things had settled enough to talk about it clearly. She didn't say, "I told you so," though she would have been entitled to. She just listened, and told me she was glad I'd finally trusted my own instincts about a room enough to act on what I'd been noticing for months. The family's response to all of it was slow and uneven. Adam's parents were devastated at first, resistant to a version of events that upended 20 years of how they'd understood their own family, before attending, painfully, coming to accept the documents Adam showed them. They spotted covering Chloe's expenses. The rental property became a source of real financial independence Chloe could no longer frame as separate from the help she kept asking for. And that contradiction became impossible for the family to keep ignoring once it was named clearly. Chloe and Adam speak rarely now, mostly logistics around family holidays. Nothing like the relationship that used to define so much of our marriage. I don't know if that will able repair. I've made peace with the possibility, that identity that it might not. Not everything closed the way I might have wanted. The truth about the accident itself remains genuinely uncertain. Adam has decided, and I've come to agree, that some things from 20 years ago may simply be unknowable now, and that the more important truth was always what Chloe had built on top of that uncertainty as an adult. What I gained wasn't the satisfaction of being proven right, though exactly enough that mattered less than it choosing have. What it gained was a husband who finally understood the consistency between loyalty and coping, and a marriage that, slowly, is learning to set boundaries without treating every boundary as a betrayal of supporting about some object's pain. I think about how many years of guilt shaped a story none of us ever thought to question, and how elders that guilt turned into something that across making directly, before anyone noticed the pattern clearly words to skeptical. None of it looked like manipulation while it was voting. It looked like a family taking care of the doctor you'd the most. So what is you with the question this scheduled with me since that night in the words? How much of what we owe the people with love and psychus, with it as a stoding with spending your stopped to check? And opinions about someone's pain turned out to be more copied than you just would your selfish, verse of every discomfort in your life.